Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first webinar by the National NAGPRA Program for 2025. This is a series of 10 webinars that we will host over the course of the year, one each month on the third Friday of the month. We did a similar series last year, and the recordings for all of those webinars are still available on our website, and I will add the link in the chat. Before we begin with the topic for today's webinar, I had a couple of announcements that I wanted to share with this broader audience. First of all, I see there's a hand raised, but the format for this today will be a presentation followed by an opportunity for Q&A. At the end of my presentation today, I will turn on the Q&A for you to ask your questions. So please refrain from raising your hands. Our process here is to use the Q&A function because it allows us, one, to be sure we're responding to everything, but also to capture those questions that we may not have time to get to. So thank you for your understanding. Okay, so to start with a couple of announcements, because we are at the beginning of the year, hopefully everybody's filling up their calendar with upcoming events, including this webinar series. I'd like to add a few more to your calendars just over the next few weeks in particular. First of all, I wanted to be sure everybody here is aware of the NAGPRA community of practice. This is a group of NAGPRA practitioners that come together with a specific mission to support each other in advancing understanding of the repatriation process. And next Friday on January 24th will be one of the bi-monthly calls for that group. I've put a link in the chat to the NAGPRA community of practice. The second announcement I wanted to make is that we at the National NAGPRA Program are currently seeking nominations to the NAGPRA Review Committee. Nominations from Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations may be submitted until February 3rd for an individual nominated to be a traditional Indian religious leader. There is a Federal Register notice that solicits and gives more information, and I've posted a link to that in the chat. Again, the deadline for those nominations is February 3rd. The third announcement I have for you today is that there, as hopefully you are aware, the Association on American Indian Affairs will be hosting its 10th annual Repatriation Conference in February, at the end of the month, on February 25th. And last week, AIA released its agenda for the 2025 conference. Registration is required by February 19th. So if you're interested in attending that repatriation conference, please register by February 19th. Just for your information, the agenda includes several hours of NAGPRA training, and the National NAGPRA Program will be participating in that training. So if you're interested in in-person training, please register and attend that conference. The fourth and final announcement I have pertains to NAGPRA grants. As hopefully you are aware, we changed the deadline this year for NAGPRA repatriation grants in particular. We were able to extend that deadline to provide additional opportunity for applications now at this time. So we have an open announcement for repatriation grants that is open through May 9th of this year. This is a change. We were able to extend this timeline a year longer than usual. And we are still waiting on those requests for repatriation grants. So please submit any requests for repatriation grants that you may have. There's no reason to delay applying for repatriation grants. Repatriation grants can be applied for by museums or tribes, and can be used to support the physical transfer of human remains or cultural items from a museum to a tribe. So please look at our website on the grants page. I've posted, again, another link in the chat if you have questions about that process. But again, money is currently available for that. Okay, so for today's webinar, the topic is timelines and deadlines for repatriation in particular. On the events page for today, I shared a link to a paragraph in the final regulations that provides some detailed timelines for reporting and for repatriation. I will add that link, but I will also be sharing this on my screen. Sorry, too many screens. Here you are. Here's the link to the final rule, the focus of the timelines for repatriation, which will be the topic of our discussion today. Give me a moment. I'm trying to share my screen with you. Okay. So in publishing the final regulations for NAGPRA, as hopefully you are aware, were published in December of 2023 and became effective in January of 2024. We included several tables, but in particular, 2 tables related to the timeframes for reporting holdings or collections. Within the Federal Register, you can kind of pop out these tables in particular, which is what I've done here. Again, we will hold questions for the end of our session today. So this table, table 4 from the final regulations, the timeframes for reporting on holdings or collections, was intended to summarize the relevant timelines for various reporting requirements under these revised regulations. It's a useful tool to show in a brief glance what those timelines are. This table is organized by the longest timelines to the most recent timelines. Again, if you have questions, we will hold those until the end. And so you can see that the first 2 lines in this table include a 5-year timeline. In reviewing this table for today, I realized that just a moment, I'm going to pause for a second and make sure there are no issues with people seeing and hearing. Okay, I have some feedback that everything seems fine to participants. So if you're having any trouble seeing or hearing, you can certainly email us at the National NAGPRA program immediately, and somebody else will be able to respond to you. That address is nagpra_info@nps.gov. And again, we'll hold questions until the end of the webinar today. Thank you everybody for the feedback and the thumbs up. I appreciate it. It's always disconcerting when people raise their hands, you're not sure what's happening. Okay, so I'll proceed, and hopefully any issues that people might be having can be resolved by our team at, again, NAGPRA_info@nps.gov. All right. So these timelines, again, as I was looking at this today in preparation, I realized that we use the overall timelines, but there are a few instances here where actually we could put in dates. Now that these regulations have been published and have been effective as of the January of 2024. And so I wanted to talk through this table today. That was my plan for the presentation, was to talk through table 4 as well as table 5 to maybe give some examples of questions we've received related to these kinds of timelines. And then we will open up the Q&A and have additional time for questions or comments. So you'll see from this table that we have summarized sort of the different actions of a museum or federal agency in the first column. The second column indicates what action is required in those circumstances. And then the third column is the timeline or the deadline. And then the last column provides a reference to the regulations themselves for where you can find that information. So the first row here, the first line of this table is for where a museum or federal agency has human remains and associated funerary objects that have not been published in a notice of inventory completion. So again, these are human remains and funerary objects that were reported in an inventory by the first deadline in 1995 or a deadline after that, but a notice was not published for those human remains and associated funerary objects. In those cases, then the museum or federal agency must update its inventory, and that includes conducting consultation. And the museum or federal agency must do so no later than 5 years after these regulations became effective. And that deadline, with the effective date of January of 2024, the deadline for updating an inventory is January 10th, 2029. You can find this, again, detailed in the regulations at 10.10, letter D, number 3. And I pulled that up here on my screen so you can see it. Again, no later than January 10th, 2029, for any human remains or associated funerary objects listed in an inventory but not published in a notice of inventory completion, the federal agency must do 4 things. It must initiate consultation. It must consult with requesting parties. It must update its inventory to include the decision points that are required under these regulations. And it must submit that updated inventory to all consulting parties and to the National NAGPRA program. This updated inventory is a new requirement. In the old regulations, there was no requirement or timeline to update an inventory. However, for those of you who have been involved with NAGPRA for some time will know that updating inventories was a regular process that many museums and federal agencies engaged in. Pardon me. But here we have reset a timeline for updating inventories. And the intent here between this deadline is to reset the timeline, really to reset the timeline that was initially intended by Congress, which was that for museums and federal agencies, there is an obligation to identify all Native American human remains and associated funerary objects, and to complete an inventory. Completing an inventory or updating the inventory is a clear requirement of the Act itself. And however, we know that over the last 34 years of NAGPRA implementation, This has been an ongoing process. So this is a kind of a major new deadline put into these regulations. Going back to the final regulations, again, we addressed this as well as summarize all of the comments we received on this timeline generally in this comment number 92. If you want to read more about the comments we received about these timelines, as well as our specific response, you can find that in the final regulations. Again, I've posted a link in the chat to the tables. The paragraphs are just above that. You can also find it, it was linked on our events page, this specific part of the final regulations. So again, this is that first timeline here. And this is a new deadline, a new requirement to update inventories under the revised regulations. Again, it's important to note that this updated inventory requires initiating consultation. That's the first step in updating an inventory. So hopefully, many of you have already started this step over the last year and have initiated consultation on any outstanding human remains or associated funerary objects that have not been published in a notice. Going on down, you will see that there is another 5-year deadline where a museum or a museum really receives federal funds for the first time and has possession or control of human remains or associated funerary objects. This is essentially if a museum has never received federal funding and therefore was never subject to NAGPRA, but does have possession or control of human remains and associated funerary objects, the museum must complete an inventory within 5 years of receiving federal funds. This was a timeline that was in the previous regulatory framework. It was in what used to be called the future applicability section. This is that same 5-year timeline. And really, it's the same 5-year timeline that Congress provided in 1990 for museums and federal agencies to complete their inventory. So those are the longest timelines that we have in reporting holdings or collections. And from there, there's shorter timelines involved. I'm going to skip the next line on cultural items and continue to discuss human remains and associated funerary objects. There's another timeline here for when a museum or federal agency acquires or locates human remains or associated funerary objects. This means, again, those human remains or associated funerary objects were either not in the possession or control of the museum or federal agency, or the museum or federal agency had not located them and never reported them. In those cases, then a museum or federal agency must initiate consultation and complete an inventory within 2 years of acquiring or locating human remains and associated funerary objects. And again, the citation for this goes back to the regulations in Table 1. It lays out those options for the timelines. Again, this is not a new timeline. This is from the old regulations, included this again in the future applicability section for acquisition or location of human remains or funerary objects, and included this same 2-year time frame. We often get questions about this timeline in particular. As many of you are aware, many museums or federal agencies are identifying human remains and associated funerary objects that they might previously not have identified or located. And certainly there might be acquisition in terms of newly identified possession or control of human remains and associated funerary objects. And that is what would trigger this timeline. Now you may be wondering how this timeline of the 2 years corresponds to that first timeline of the 5 years for updating. They cover different categories, is the best way I can describe it. In the first 5-year timeline, those are human remains and associated funerary objects that the museum has previously reported in an inventory, but has not completed a notice. For that category, there's a 5-year timeline to update the inventory. But where a museum or federal agency has identified new, whether newly acquired or newly located, human remains and associated funerary objects, there is a 2-year timeline to complete the inventory. And again, you can find this referenced in the table in 10.10 as in the last column. I'm going to move on to the next 2 rows because these are the deadlines that we have just passed. Again, as I mentioned to you before, in looking at this table, I realized that these timelines reference a year, but could now be filled in with dates. And in this case, these 2 lines, where a museum has custody of a federal agency collection or has custody of a collection that cannot be identified, the entity with possession or control cannot be identified. We're given a 1-year timeline, and that was 1 year from the effective date. That date to submit statements to federal agencies and to the National NAGPRA program just passed on Monday. That date was January 13th of this year. And I know that so many of you have been very busy with your statements, both sending and acknowledging receipt from the federal agency side. We certainly have received plenty here in the National NAGPRA program, and we are working on I guess saving them is but filing them really is what we're doing. We're working on incorporating them into our filing system. We don't have a count right now. My best estimate is somewhere around 1,000 of statements that we received based just on the email traffic. That's not really an accurate number at this point. We will have a more accurate number at some point as soon as we get through the volume of emails that we received. So in those cases, again, this goes back to section 10.8 of the regulations. And this is, as best I can describe it, a catch-up provision that we have included in these regulations. We know that for the last 34 years of NAGPRA, there are many collections of, many holdings or collections of either human remains or cultural items that have been in a kind of limbo because of a question around possession or control, a question of who has responsibility for that holding or collection. And so these 2 requirements to submit a statement is an effort to at least clarify who has that responsibility. So by and large, the largest number of statements we receive are in the first category of museum that has custody of a federal agency holding or collection. The requirement was for a museum to submit a statement to the federal agency as well as to the National NAGPRA program by Monday, January 13th of this week. And again, the statement is a simple statement about the holding or collection and why the museum believes that it belongs to, I'm using that term instead of possession or control, but why the federal agency has responsibility for that collection. I wanted to point out that this is connected then to the line above. So let's propose a hypothetical, which is really more of a concrete example. And that is that a museum has had a collection, maybe for 80, 90 years. And that collection, the museum has identified, belongs to, is in the possession or control of a federal agency. And maybe they've never told the federal agency, or maybe they told the federal agency and the federal agency forgot. Nevertheless, that collection has been in the museum's custody, but is the responsibility of the federal agency, and nobody, either the museum or the federal agency, has reported that collection under NAGPRA. If this week the federal agency received a statement from that museum about the collection, and if the federal agency agrees that it has possession or control of that collection, then as soon as the federal agency agrees to possession or control, it has really located, I would say, human remains and associated funerary objects it was not previously aware of. And that would mean there's a 2-year timeline for the federal agency to complete an inventory for any human remains and associated funerary objects in that holding or collection. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little convoluted, and I understand that, but I think if you work through the hypothetical, again, the goal of these statements is to fix what we know is an outstanding problem. What we didn't know, and what we found out this week, is the volume of this problem. The number of museums that have custody of collections that are in the possession or control of a federal agency. Now, I'd also like to say that there are many, many, many examples, and I don't want to dismiss these positive examples, where museums and federal agencies have been in close communication for a long time, in some cases even for the last 34 years, over a holding or collection that is a federal agency responsibility. And so we did receive some statements that clearly the federal agency, the museum, have already been working on this collection. All that was required was really a statement that they're working on it and they will continue to work on it. In terms of the timeline for that, again, it will go to whether or not those human remains were previously reported in an inventory. And if so, and if not published in a notice, then they would need to follow that 5-year timeline for an updated inventory. But anything in these statements to federal agencies that is newly located for the federal agency or never reported in an inventory or a summary would have this timeline of 2 years for the human remains and associated funerary objects. And I'll skip down here to the next line, a 6-month timeline for submitting a summary. The 6-month timeline for submitting a summary, again, these are for cultural items that are not human remains or associated funerary objects. And that timeline is 6 months to complete a summary. That is the same timeline under the old regulations in the future applicability requirements. Anytime a museum or federal agency acquires or locates cultural items that were not reported in a summary, it must compile and submit that summary within 6 months. Okay. Please forgive my voice. I am overcoming a cold. The bottom part of this table covers the additional actions that are required. I'm going to skip ahead to this response where a federal agency has received a statement this week from a museum. It has 180 days, and that is 180 calendar days, which is roughly 6 months, to respond to the museum on the federal agency holding or collection. To either, the federal agency has 3 options for its response. It can either agree that it has possession or control, it can disagree that it has possession or control, or the third option is to request the museum and the federal agency work together jointly on the inventory process or the summary process. Those are the 3 options for a federal agency in this response. Technically, there is a 4th option for a federal agency in responding to these statements, and that is to do nothing. If a federal agency does nothing in response to these statements, then the federal agency has possession or control. We've already seen a few responses from federal agencies where, again, those cases where there was already pre-existing communication and work, or even where there was not, and it's very clear to the federal agency that they had possession or control, the response was very simple. So these statements and this requirement for a statement can be a pretty simple process in some cases. In other cases, federal agencies may need the additional time to get additional information from the museum about the collection or to look into its own records about the collection. The last few lines here, I've skipped this one. There is under the revised regulations a requirement that after completion or update of an inventory, again of human remains and associated funerary objects, that a museum or federal agency must submit a notice of inventory completion within 6 months of completing or updating the inventory. This is a new requirement. It's both a new requirement and not a new requirement. The law itself requires that 6 months after completing an inventory, that a notice be published in the Federal Register. What has happened over the last 34 years is that there was this, again, a limbo created for those human remains where the inventory identified the human remains as culturally unidentifiable. There was no requirement to proceed to a notice for the culturally unidentifiable human remains. The change in the updated regulations is that all human remains and associated funerary objects, regardless of cultural affiliation, must be published in a notice of inventory completion 6 months after completing or updating the inventory. So again, this is a change that all human remains and cultural items must be published in a notice of inventory completion. Now that notice is dependent upon the timeline for completing and updating an inventory. So in the case where a federal agency has only recently located human remains and associated funerary objects it did not know about and did not previously report, it must complete its inventory, including consultation, within 2 years, and 6 months after completing that inventory, it must submit a notice of inventory completion. Likewise, for museums and federal agencies that fit that first category, the first line on this table, where human remains and associated funerary objects were previously reported in an inventory, but a notice has not been published, the inventory must be updated by January 10th of 2029, and a notice of inventory completion must be submitted 6 months after that update. So again, by predicting out the dates for those human remains that must be put in an updated inventory by January 10th, 2029, the notice will be due then by July of 2029. So again, the table kind of collapses all of this information that is in the regulations in one place for sort of an easy reference. I also realize that walking through it this way may be a little confusing as we're jumping around, but hopefully we'll continue to talk through this and it will make more sense. So again, the bottom 3 lines here relate to additional reporting requirements with a timeline of 30 days. So in the case where a museum or federal agency acquires a holding or collection that was previously reported, so where a museum or federal agency acquires a collection that was previously listed in an inventory or summary, within 30 days of acquiring that collection, it must inform the National NAGPRA program, and it must inform the tribes as a means of initiating consultation. That new acquisition still falls within the 2-year timeline for completing the inventory or 6 months for the summary. But there is a notification requirement here where a holding or collection is being moved from one museum or federal agency to another, if that makes sense. So where a museum or a federal agency previously reported a collection, and then it and the receiving party have agreed to exchange or transfer that collection, then there is this 30-day timeline for notifying everybody of that transfer between a museum and a federal agency, or museum and a museum, or a federal agency and a federal agency. And then the 2-year timeline kicks in for for the newly acquired or newly located collection. When a summary is compiled, consultation must be initiated within 30 days. So as we talked about, this requirement of 6 months to compile and submit a summary, that is submitted to the National NAGPRA program. And then the second step in the summary process is to initiate consultation, and that must occur 30 days after compiling a summary. And in both sections of the repatriation process, whether for summaries or inventories, anytime a new consulting party is identified, consultation must be initiated within 30 days. So again, this table refers to the reporting, the broad reporting requirements for museums and federal agencies and the timelines. And it's organized again by the longest timelines to the shortest timelines. It's a little bit of a jump around the different sections between human remains and associated funerary objects versus cultural items. But hopefully this helps kind of illuminate some of these timelines and deadlines. I'm going to move next to the second table of timelines, and this is for responding to requests for repatriation. And again, there is some amount of difference here between the two sections. So the sections for summaries of cultural items versus inventories for human remains and associated funerary objects. But I wanted to stress that there are a lot of similarities here. And again, this table is organized into the longest timelines to the shortest timelines, as opposed to how this might look if it were organized in the step-by-step process. So the longest timeline for responding to a request for repatriation comes when there are competing requests for repatriation. So where a museum or federal agency has received competing requests, and this is a particular situation where multiple parties have submitted requests that are not joint requests, meaning that the parties individually want to receive repatriation and do not agree to do so jointly. In those cases, the museum or federal agency has 180 days, again, calendar days, which is roughly 6 months, to determine the most appropriate requester. And you can find the details on that process in the 2 sections that are listed in the last column, either for summaries or inventories. But again, the longest timeline for a response is that 180 days or 6 months for determining the most appropriate requester. These next 2 timelines of 90 days relate to receiving a request for a repatriation and responding to that request. So in both sections, summaries and inventories, where a museum or federal agency receives a request for repatriation, it must respond to that request within 90 days. This is the reason that requests for repatriation must be in writing, so that they can be an identifiable date for that request for repatriation. We've received a lot of questions about what does a written request for repatriation mean. It means an email from a tribe to a museum requesting repatriation. It can mean a formal letter. It can also mean a verbal conversation that is written down and that both parties agree it to as a written request for repatriation with a date. There are lots of ways that tribes can fulfill the requirement to submit a written request for repatriation, and we encourage museums and federal agencies to be as flexible as possible in that process. But there is a requirement that it be written, and so it can be dated as well. And that is to ensure that the museum or federal agency knows what that 90-day time frame is for responding to a request for repatriation. In addition to the 90 days for responding to a request, there's another 90-day piece of this timeline, and that is for sending repatriation statements. The last step in both processes is to send a repatriation statement, and that must be done within 90 days. When the 90 days is triggered varies a little bit between the two sections, but in general, again, in that 90-day period, is to complete the repatriation statement. You will, if you've been involved with NAGPRA for a while, you will recognize 90 days as a previously used time frame. When you look at the at the Act itself, the Act does not give specific timelines in very many cases, but does repeatedly talk about expeditious repatriation. And in the old regulatory framework and in this regulatory framework, 90 days is basically what we have assigned to that concept of expeditious repatriation. And again, the days here are calendar days, so 90 days is roughly 3 months. There are a few other timelines in responding to requests. And again, it varies a little bit based on the summary versus the inventory process. In the summary process in particular, there is a requirement to publish a notice of intended repatriation that follows a request for repatriation. So once the museum receives a request, responds to the request, it must then publish a notice, submit a notice, and that must be done 30 days after agreeing to the request for repatriation. There is an additional timeline here for notifying parties of competing requests. There is a 14-day requirement, again, related to this first one. There's 180 days to make a decision about the most appropriate requester when there are competing requests. But prior to that, there's a 2-week window for museums and federal agencies to ensure everybody is aware that there are competing requests. And the last timeline here is one that maybe a few of you, but thankfully only a few of you have encountered. This is a new timeline where a notice is submitted to my office, and for whatever reason that notice does not meet the requirements of the regulations, we will return the notice to the museum or federal agency and request that they resubmit that notice within 14 days. So we've only had to reject a few notices in this way or return notices in this way. But that is the 14-day timeline in the regulations require. So again, these two tables in the regulations are useful and helpful in sort of summarizing all of these, but I do think that the organization can be a little bit more confusing, where if you look at these timelines in terms of the step-by-step process, it can be a little clearer. And so I wanted to also remind all of you of this document that we produced in December of 2023 and posted just after the regulations published. That includes estimated timelines for both of the step-by-step processes. So this is the repatriation of human remains or associated funerary objects. And further on in the document is a timeline for cultural items. And what we've done here is applied those timelines to the longest timeline on the far right, and also estimated the shortest timeline. So this gives you a span for what these hypothetical timelines might be. It's important to note that in both cases, we have made an assumption about the involvement of Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. Because certain steps depend on actions by lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs, we have assumed 1 day in step 3 and the same day in step 6. But those processes will likely take longer. And the goal here was not to identify necessarily, well, I don't want to say it's not a realistic timeline. I think it is a realistic timeline, but it does make that assumption. And certainly there is a significant role here that Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations play in this time frame and this timeline. Let me just add a link to this document in the chat in case you're wondering where it lives. You can find the PDF here, but it's also available through our policy page. I want to emphasize a point that is made repeatedly in the final regulations and at this time, and I'm going to jump back to the final regulations. Just below the 2 tables that we've walked through is this paragraph, which is repeated throughout the regulations, throughout the final regulations. I'm going to go ahead and read it, although it's on your screen and hopefully you are familiar with this, but I want to be very clear that the regulations and the timelines and deadlines under the regulations are triggered by a request for repatriation from lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs. If a museum or federal agency is involved in meaningful and effective consultation with lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs, pressure to complete the repatriation within a set time frame may be significantly alleviated. There's only one exception to the request requirement, and that's the timeline for museums or federal agencies to update an inventory of human remains and associated funerary objects. We further stress, and this is in direct response to comments we received, that an extension of the deadline, that one deadline for an inventory update or an inventory completion, an extension may be requested by any museum that has made a good faith effort to update its inventory. However, please note that these new regulations have added to the requirement for an extension the written agreement of the consulting parties to the request for an extension. Again, in response to comments we received, which are summarized above, some comments said it would take a very long time to update inventories. Our response was that if a museum will need an additional 10 or 20 or even 50 years to complete or update its inventory, it can only do so by first engaging in meaningful and effective consultation with lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and NHOs. With the changes to these regulations, we hope to provide a clear path to repatriation where lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and NHOs, rather than museums and federal agencies, can define what expeditious repatriation means. That last sentence, I think, encapsulates our approach, the Department of the Interior's approach to these timelines and deadlines. We wanted to ensure that there is a clear path, and that clear path requires museums and federal agencies to take certain actions and to complete certain tasks, but does provide the opportunity for Indian tribes and NHOs to decide how to proceed expeditiously by when they time their requests. Okay, I think that was everything that I was hoping to cover today. I'm going to go ahead and turn on, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, although be happy to share if there are specific questions. And I'm doing that so I can figure out where the Q&A button is. Rather than allowing questions by voice, we do want to request that you type your question into the Q&A. So I'm making Q&A available right now. You should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we will, again, receive questions through the Q&A. And I also want to note that you have the opportunity to upvote questions. So if somebody asks a question and you have the same question, you can upvote that question and it will raise to the top of my list. All right, it looks like many people had their questions all ready to go. So we've got a few in here. Let me go ahead and take care of some of the simple ones. And I appreciate, again, I want to call out my staff who are online and assisting with the responses. Thank you so much. I could not keep track of all of this by myself for sure. So first question, where do we find consultants for inventories? I'm not quite sure what the question there is. If the question is, how do you identify consulting parties, meaning Indian tribes or NHOs, for human remains and associated funerary objects? That is detailed in the regulations, and the consulting parties are potentially culturally affiliated Indian tribes or NHOs. If your question is, where do you find a consultant, meaning an outside party to assist in the process of an inventory, I would send you to the community of practice to answer that kind of question. Someone else asked if the recording will be available, and it will on our events page. The next question, I want to, am I the best person to contact if there are questions? Yes, but please send your questions to the NAGPRA info box so that we can share the joy among our small team in responding to questions. So again, any questions that you might have, you're welcome to send them to us at the National NAGPRA program using our general inbox, which is nagpra_info@nps.gov. All right, got some good upvoted questions here. To confirm with an example, according to the timelines in Table 4, if an institution were to locate ancestral remains on February 1st, 2025, that have never been included in an inventory, that institution would only have until February 1st, 2027 to complete an inventory. That is correct. And yes, the question is, or rather than the longer timeline, that 5-year timeline. That is correct. Any newly located ancestral remains must be put into an inventory within 2 years, and that includes consultation. We are aware that there are many ancestral remains that have not been reported in an inventory. However, those ancestral remains were required to be identified and reported by 1995. And since 2007, the NAGPRA regulations have included this 2-year timeline for any newly identified human remains to be reported. So we have, again, reiterated that 2-year timeline for any newly located ancestral remains to be put into an inventory. And remember, that 2-year timeline must include initiation of consultation. Okay, I'm going to sort through the upvotes again. We have another question about extensions. What if you only get responses for consultation from a small portion of potentially culturally affiliated parties, I would say, because consulting parties are broader than claimants or requesters. So if you are working on an inventory for human remains, and you're not going to be able to complete that inventory by the 2-year deadline for newly located ancestors, or by the 5-year deadline for updates, and you've reached out to everybody, initiated consultation broadly with potentially culturally affiliated tribes, but only a small portion of those parties have responded to you. Then you need to, first of all, you need to be sure that you're keeping a clear record of consultation, because the request for an extension requires first that you show you did initiate consultation. Second, you would want to list the names of all consulting parties and the consent to the extension request from a majority of them. And this is where I would say your consultation record that shows who responded and who did not, as well as your efforts to contact consulting parties, is what you would use to demonstrate whether or not a majority of consulting parties have given their consent to the extension. So again, if you have a large group of parties that you've invited to consult, only a small group have responded to your request for consultation, and within that small group, a majority consent to the extension of a timeline, then that is what you would send in your extension request. Now, I want to point out here that the museum the museum in this case for an extension should submit a request to me, the manager of the National NAGPRA program, and that request must be received before the deadline for the inventory. This only applies to inventories. And along with that request should be there are 4 things that need to be included in an extension request. And the second thing is that consent from the consulting parties. And in that case, it is possible that the assistant secretary, who is the one that makes the decision on that extension request, will consider all of that information. So again, I hope that helps answer that question. Okay, is there an updated federal contact list, as the current list is outdated? And I want to shout out to Tanner and Audrey, who are the fellows with the National NAGPRA program, who are jumping right in and answering questions. And Tanner has provided a link to our contact database. However, as Tanner notes, that is a voluntary database, and so it may be that there's some outdated contacts there. I think that you're asking for federal contacts, for federal agencies in particular. And again, there's lots of information available from federal agencies themselves on federal agency web pages for contact information. There is also some information that's been shared by federal agencies. And if there's a specific contact that you've been unable to find, you're welcome to reach out to the National NAGPRA program, and we'll let you know if we have a contact that might be helpful. Again, I'm trying to pull up quickly, and those of you who have attended these webinars before know that I pretty much have a great memory when it comes to where resources are located. I'm struggling a little bit today. I'm going to blame the cold medicine on that. We have several sources that we can refer you to in terms of where you can help identify federal agency contacts. One source might be the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation has a list of federal preservation officers, and usually NAGPRA responsibilities are either located or can be identified by that federal preservation office. In addition to that, of course, many federal agencies have NAGPRA coordinators. Again, either contact us. Sending a message to the NAGPRA community practice also wouldn't be a bad idea, as many museums have been working on identifying these contacts. Okay, I'm resorting again. All right. Thank you for the question. Are there time-bound rules, deadlines for responding to a tribe's request for consultation, while also awaiting for replies from other tribes? So it's a great question, and I thank you for asking it. In the proposed regulations, we did include that kind of a deadline for responding to a request for consultation. However, we received a lot of comments and feedback, especially from Indian tribes, on that timeline and process. And so in the final regulations, there is no timeline or deadline for responding to a tribe's request for consultation. However, as I noted, for human remains and associated funerary objects, there is a timeline to complete or update an inventory, and consultation must occur before that. So in some respects, there's a built-in timeline, so to speak, in that there's an end date for the process. If you're talking about cultural items in the summary and a tribe requests to consult on a summary collection, there is no timeline for the museum to respond to that request to consult. There is a timeline for the museum to respond to a request for repatriation, however. It's the 90-day timeline. So if a tribe had made a request for consultation on cultural items, for example, and the museum was being non-responsive, then perhaps making a request for repatriation would be a way to trigger that timeline. On the other hand, if there is a request for consultation on human remains or associated funerary objects and the museum is not being responsive, again, there is a timeline of either 2 years or 5 years to complete that inventory process. And it could be that there are other ways the tribe might try to compel consultation in those cases. What these regulations are trying to avoid, and what the question may be referring to, is a past practice, certainly under the old regulations, where consultation could go on seemingly forever. And a consultation could depend on getting a response from all potential culturally affiliated or consulting parties. And we know that there are examples where museums used that process of consultation really as a means of delaying the repatriation process for human remains in particular. And so with the new regulations and the new deadlines, we are hoping to prevent that kind of continued delay for purposes of consultation. Okay, we have another question, which Audrey, one of our fellows at the National NAGPRA program, has helpfully responded to. But I will go ahead and read it out and read Audrey's answer. Our museum has found new human remains, funerary objects, and cultural items all together. Do we need to submit a summary of the cultural items within 6 months of the discovery, separately from the funerary objects and remains? Do we do consultation first, or does the time start right away? What I really mean, the question follows up, is can we consult to determine if items are cultural or funerary, and then 6-month timer starts, or does the timer start as soon as we see the object in the vault? Audrey responded by providing the table in 10.9, and then answered, the summary must be submitted 6 months after locating the objects. So yes, as soon as you see the objects in the vault, the time starts. Maybe you don't even see the objects in the vault, but you see records indicating that you have you have a collection of human remains and cultural items that are subject to NAGPRA and have never been reported. That's when the timeline starts. You have 6 months to send a summary of cultural items. And yes, that is not human remains or funerary objects, but the cultural items. The summary is a broad description. So in the case of a summary, you don't have to identify whether these are in fact cultural items. You need to send a broad description of the collection. And in those cases, the summary again is a simple letter that informs the tribes that you have a collection and may contain cultural items that may be connected to them. The questioner responded with, what if we don't know the culture of that collection? Well, you want to use whatever information you have about that collection. What do you know about where it was removed from? Say you don't know anything. It's a box you found, and the box has human remains and cultural items in it, and you don't know anything else except that it's in your collection. You would want to look at the collection history of your museum. What kinds of things are in your collection? Is your museum dedicated to a particular kind of collection or a particular location? That's information about that box. If you have any identification about when that box appeared in the museum's vault, would start to tell you more about your collection and who you need to reach out to. But it may be that the only information you have is that this box is in our museum. And then you would start by looking at who is potentially culturally affiliated to your museum, to the location in which this box was identified. And that's at least where you would start. Great question, follow-up again. Thank you so much for these questions and the follow-up. They're really helpful. Does consultation mean partnering with a third party or actual tribes? It means actual Indian tribes and NHOs. When I say the word consultation, I mean it means you reach out to invite consultation with Indian tribes directly. Now, some museums do use consultants to facilitate that process, but NAGPRA is not going to indicate that requirement in any way. Rather, NAGPRA is going to say, you as the museum must communicate with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. That is your requirement. So you are required to reach out to tribes about your collection. Maybe I'll pause here for a minute. Again, feel free to ask more questions and upvote questions that you have the same question for. I'm going to pause right here and give an example of a recent call that I had with the museum who found that it had collections that it didn't realize it had. And I'm sharing this as an example of a best practice. The first thing that museum did when it found, and here it's actually a university. Museums have a very broad definition in NAGPRA. In this case, it was a university that found it had a collection it didn't realize it had, never reported it. Thankfully, the collection did not include human remains, but only cultural items. The first thing that the university professor did was to call the Indian tribe that was located nearest the university campus and ask them to come take a look. That's not what NAGPRA requires, but it is a positive step forward, certainly reaching out to a local community to come provide guidance and advice is a great first step, especially where the university already has a working relationship with that located tribe. There might be lots of reasons why the tribe located nearby might have a close relationship with the university that doesn't relate to NAGPRA. And building on that relationship is helpful. What NAGPRA requires is that the museum or university in this case send a summary to the Indian tribes that might have an interest in that collection. But this university, their first impulse of this university professor was to reach out to a tribal representative and to seek some information and input. And that's a great first impulse. Too often in these kinds of circumstances, museums or universities will call our office, and the last thing they want to do is to reach out to tribes. But that's not, that doesn't help. Being afraid of reaching out doesn't help solve the problem. Is it easy? No. Are the tribes potentially going to be really mad? Yes. But you know what? That's just a part of this process. You've got to release some of that anxiety and fear about communicating with tribes about your collections, because NAGPRA requires that communication. And NAGPRA requires the communication be in writing. And obviously that, as I said, that first impulse of the professor to reach out to a local tribe is not what NAGPRA requires. So you don't have to do that. But where you have an existing relationship with a tribe, it's a great way to get started. It's a great way to alleviate fear. And remember, at some point, you're going to have to reach out to the tribes and tell them that you have this collection. And you may have to tell them that you've had this collection and you didn't know you had it. And it's not going to be an easy conversation, but the conversation has to start. That's what NAGPRA requires. Okay, I'm going to sort again by upvotes, try to get to the top ones. Oh, we've got lots of questions. Okay, the top voted question right now is, how would you make a determination of the appropriate agency or party to be in control of collection if it was collected on land before the land was a park or a federal agency? So for example, if a museum reached out with a statement of a holding or collection with items collected from the park prior to the park's establishment. And in this case, I'm going to read park to mean national park, as in a federal agency property. Some of that will depend on the nature of the place in particular. So, for example, the Grand Canyon was designated as a national monument prior to becoming a national park. It predates the National Park Service as an entity. So therefore, if something was removed from the Grand Canyon, it may be that the park is the proper a federal agency to refer this to. And well, in the case of the Grand Canyon, I'm going to say that's pretty much true, even, because the park predates the Park Service, still the National Park Service that would assist with the repatriation there. And certainly for something as large as the Grand Canyon. Again, it's going to depend a lot on the circumstances involved with that particular property. I'm going to give the same answer I did before with related to consultation with tribes. Communication is required by these regulations, so you might as well reach out to the park and see if they can help you with this question. But certainly the job of the museum in creating those statements is to identify who is responsible for this collection. If you have a collection that was taken from federal land, and maybe you're not sure when it was removed and when it was federal land, start by talking to the federal agency and see if they can help clarify. And sending that statement can be the first step. Maybe you say, hey, federal agency, we think this is yours. And the federal agency is going to come back and tell you, no, it's not ours. It predates our ownership. or it's not ours, it belongs to a federal agency like the General Land Office that used to exist but does no longer. But there might be referrals there, right? The General Land Office is now, the BLM has inherited that responsibility. So again, there's lots of ways that this might resolve, and I want to encourage you to talk, first of all, to the party and to the property that you're dealing with. And don't not talk. We have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try to hit the highest voted questions because I will not get to them all. And my voice is failing me, so please forgive me. And thank you again to our team who is helpfully answering questions. If we send out a notice for consultation and don't receive a reply from any tribes, what is the process and how do we document that? Thank you, Audrey, for adding the consultation resources that we have on our webpage to maybe assist with identifying additional parties. I would also recommend that you take a look, and maybe Audrey can find a link to the consultation record, which I think we have is on the template page, I think, where you can track non-responsiveness. So you need to keep track of invitations to consult and non-response. That's a part of your responsibilities in the consultation process, is to make that record. And certainly you need to initiate consultation in writing, but it can be followed up by phone calls or other ways of making sure that the message has been received. And I'll just add, even though the question does not ask it, that even if you don't receive a response to your request to consult, you still have to meet the deadline for inventories of human remains and associated funerary objects. So again, you want to start the consultation process and keep track of your efforts to consult, but responding to a request for consultation, it is up to the tribe to determine whether or not they are going to respond to that. All right, the next question is, what will the timeline for civil penalties be if there is non-compliance? And yes, so Audrey helpfully entered the response requirement for an allegation. What will the timeline for civil penalties be if there's non-compliance? I think maybe you're asking if a museum misses a deadline or a timeline that we've described, what's the penalty? There's no direct penalty for missing a deadline. However, as the answer from Audrey indicates, any person can allege that a museum has failed to comply with NAGPRA, and that could include missing a deadline. So if someone were to make an allegation to our office that a museum failed to comply with NAGPRA because it did not meet one of these deadlines or timelines, then we would take action on that allegation. And that action, within 90 days of receiving the allegation, we must determine whether it meets the requirements for an allegation and would proceed then to the civil penalty process. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. Okay, a next question. And Audrey, thank you again, Audrey and Tanner, for jumping right in here. How do I know if my items are funerary or cultural items? I have some pipes and I have no idea what they are or who they belong to. Audrey gave the best answer: consultation. You will need to begin the consultation process, and again provided some of the consultation resources we have. If you have Native American cultural items and you have no idea what they are or who they belong to, you need to start talking to somebody. Maybe, as in the example I gave you, that is reaching out to an Indian tribe that is located near where your museum is. Maybe it is reaching out to an Indian tribe that is connected to the general collection practices of your institution, if they're different than the general location. There are any number of ways that you might identify consulting parties, and the purpose is to start the process. All right, we have another upvoted question here, which is for summaries, does initiate consultation involve sending a summary letter with an invitation to consult, or does it need to be more concrete than that? Thinking about working with tribes who may not have certain cultural items at the top of their priority list. Okay. I think I see. Yeah, I think we're all a little wondering what more concrete means, but let me try to interpret this a little bit more. Initiate consultation means sending a summary letter, just generally describing your collection. It does not need to be more concrete or more detailed. If your concern is that you have an item that you think might be really important to a tribe, and sending a general description to that tribe will not highlight that item for the tribe, you might want to put that in the general description. So you might say, we have, a collection of Native American objects that include baskets and other, whatever the general description is for your collection. And then you might have another sentence says, and we have this object, which has been long identified as a sacred or ceremonial object connected to your tribe. You might want to put that in your letter, because that might change the tribe's priority. You are correct, however, that it is up to the tribe to decide how they're going to engage with the summary consultation process. A tribe may decide that they don't want to approach your museum at this point for any of those items. The purpose of the summary is to give them that information so they can make that decision about whether or not to engage in consultation on your collection. And it may be, if you add that other line about the specific item that you have identified that you think might be very important to the tribe, they will respond quickly to you. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. All right, the top question right now is there a certification program for NAGPRA? There are other certificate programs around tribal law, but I haven't found one that was NAGPRA specific. There is not one that is specific to our office, to the National NAGPRA program, or to the NAGPRA legislation or regulations. The number one way to become an expert in NAGPRA is to read the regulations. That is the number one way to become certified in NAGPRA, is to read the regulations. And don't stop reading the regulations. Every time you have a question about NAGPRA, we encourage you to go to the regulations to look for the answer. Because remember, we created these regulations intentionally for you, museum and federal agency, to use, to understand what your obligations and responsibilities are. Obviously, is a role for Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations here, and I don't want to ignore that. It's a critical role. But the orientation of these regulations is to museums and federal agencies to carry out these tasks. So hopefully that's all the certification you need is read the regulations, get to know them, get to understand them, and get to be able to use them. There are certainly a number of training opportunities, including these webinars, past webinars that we've conducted, as well as a lot of training resources and videos. You can find those on our YouTube channel. Okay, next upvoted question, again, had an answer. How can we obtain a copy of the museum's summaries or inventories that were previously submitted? You can reach out to us at the National NAGPRA program, and we can assist you with that. However, let me note here, we get a lot of these requests. Recently, we received a request from a museum for a copy of their summary or inventory, I can't remember, and we had just fulfilled that request less than a year ago. They were asking again because somebody left and didn't leave the copy. Please, if you're going to ask us for a copy, put it somewhere safe. Find some way that your institution can retain this information. Because while we have an obligation to retain this information, and we have an obligation, we're happy to share it with you. But it's a burden on us. We just take our time to provide this to you. Obviously, we have them scanned. It's not that difficult today. But please limit the number of times you ask us for the same thing. And please institute some kind of process within your own institution to keep track of these records. We understand that a lot of you inherited this work and inherited these positions, and maybe you didn't inherit any files. But the reality is, these should be a part of your permanent collection files. You have other permanent collection files at your museum, and the NAGPRA related documents should be a part of that, even for a small institution. So please find a way to take care of these records so that it can live beyond you. All right, I'll turn to the last upvoted question, and then hopefully we'll be able to address your other questions later on. Either if we didn't get to your question, you can send it to us at nagpra_info@nps.gov. But we do keep these, and we're working through, with the help of our fellows, some way of better communicating the questions we've been asked and the answers that we've already provided. Okay, the last question I'll do today is relates to the topic today. Does acquired previously reported human remains or cultural items refer to items that were previously published in the Federal Register, or is there another definition of previously reported? Previously reported, thank you, Lisa, for answering, means included in an inventory or summary. Where a collection has been published in a notice, then there's a slightly different status to that, depending on whether we're talking about inventories or summaries. Because some decisions have been made, certainly, in publication of that notice. And but previously reported would mean reported in an inventory or summary in this case. Again, if we can help with specific questions, we're happy to. Well, I appreciate all of your time today. I appreciate you listening to my rather challenged voice today. If any of you talked to me earlier in the week, you'll know it's better than it was. So we have that it's on the uptick. But thank you all for being here today. Thank you for your time and your attention. And I want to thank you each and every one for paying attention to this very important work. And we are here to help you in whatever way we can. Thank you and have a wonderful weekend.